they really need, that they have no substitute for, the rare earths, very rare minerals that are used in a lot of defense and military, space, high-tech applications, nearly all of which are produced and processed in China. And China's just put export controls and temporarily frozen those supplies.
A major survey out today finds UK businesses are in a state of despondency, with confidence at its lowest level for 2 years, as firms struggle to cope with increasingly uncertain economic outlooks. In the past hour or so, though, US Vice President J.D. Vance says there's a good chance that Britain and the US can secure a trade deal amid the turmoil caused by Donald Trump's tariff war. All of this, William, is a fascinating kind of jigsaw puzzle this morning of where we are at with global relations with countries around the world, including China, of course. And I actually note this on Trump, his trade war, which has been particularly offensive against China. He tweeted in 2018, when a country, i.e. the USA, is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country it does business with, trade wars are good and easy to win. But I think your column suggests his strategy on this might not be fully thought through.
Well, yes, absolutely. It's not easy to win at all for the United States to win a trade war against China. And I've pointed that out in my column, a couple of reasons why. Trump seems to think that it's the country that does all the exporting that is vulnerable in a trade war because it needs the money from that. But the reason all those exports are flowing from China to the United States is that the Americans need the actual products. And they need their iPhones or whatever it may be. And I've also pointed out in my column, they really need, that they have no substitute for, the rare earths, very rare minerals that are used in a lot of defense and military, space, high-tech applications, nearly all of which are produced and processed in China. And China's just put export controls and temporarily frozen those supplies. So I think Trump really got that the wrong way around. There are many good arguments about how China has abused trade, but he needed a far more intelligent approach than this approach of just ramping it up, going up to the 145% tariffs and then thinking, oh no, what have we done? Which is what has happened over the weekend with Trump suddenly having to decide he can't put the tariffs on the high-tech ingredients after all.
And so, Kezia, we must also surely consider our approach to China, as we've been doing on this programme this morning, again, trying to understand whether the Labour government's approach is coherent in all of this, where we heard from the government this morning that the approach is one of pragmatism and challenging China on disagreement. We've seen a challenge to China over the last few days with the, taking control of British Steel at Scunthorpe, but also questions as to how close the government is actually aligning itself with China. And the front page of the Times today, Ed Miliband signed up to close ties with China on energy. Is it sensible? Is there a sensible approach from the UK to China?
I think there is, and what I was really struck by from your interview with Sarah Jones this morning is that the lines that she took were lifted directly from Labour's manifesto in last year's general election. So this phrase around cooperating where you can, competing where you need to, and challenging where you must, that's direct language from Labour's manifesto. And I mention that because it's consistent and it shows us that it runs across all the different government departments and leading ministerial figures. And what that means is, Ed Miliband isn't going rogue here. He's doing exactly what the manifesto charged him to do, which was to cooperate with China on things like green energy. Now, of course, there have to be limits to that, and we've hit those limits around national security and national infrastructure. And in a way, this charts new territory that we have to guide our way through. But these values are the values that Labour will apply to that challenge.
William, if Trump started a trade war that he wasn't in a position to win, is the UK's strategy, as Kezia is outlining there, and Ed Miliband doing what he has been instructed to do, does all of this pragmatism mean actually we are in a position where we are hooked on Chinese investment and we're not going to be able to get out of that or get past that anytime soon?
Well, we mustn't be hooked on it. I agree with a pragmatic approach, but I think the lesson of what's just happened over British Steel is that approach has to move another notch in a skeptical and restrictive direction, because what the Chinese company tried to do with British Steel has been absolutely disgraceful. So we clearly can't have that situation arise again, that there will be lessons there for where other investments can take place. You have to have concerns about Chinese investment in nuclear power, for instance. Now, then there are other things where we do need the technology from China, particularly in renewable energy. And once you've built an offshore wind farm, it's not that you can't move it somewhere else. And somebody who's built that and invested in it will want it to operate. So I think one can be pragmatic about that, but things are going to have to move in a bit more skeptical direction than the Labour manifesto that Kezia was quoting, because something has gone seriously wrong here, and we can't let that happen again.
Kezia, how do you factor in the point that Ian Duncan-Smith made to us before? And he's a notable, he's a notable critic of China. But he was saying that Ed Miliband is selling out because China is well known for using slave labour in the development of a lot of this technology. He's saying if you're using a Chinese supply chain for things like solar panels, things like wind turbines, there is no way to avoid the fact that at some point in that supply chain, slave labour will have been used. How do you work that alongside labour values, which clearly, no government in the UK would support the use of slave labour, but particularly for a Labour Party?
Well, it's deeply uncomfortable. Of course it is, Kate. There's no denying that. And of course, we did see talk of a rebellion around the impact on the Uyghurs of everything that was being done when Ed Miliband was in China, making the case here. And look, that final point around Labour's manifesto, which is challenging where they must, that becomes more acute when you face the big kind of geopolitical challenges that we're faced with. So if the world was calmer, if we weren't in the midst of a trade war and we didn't have conflict in Ukraine, that challenge where we must would be energy spent on issues like the Uyghur genocide. You've got to suspect and hope. But the reality now is that the instinct in Britain is to protect itself and to use that challenge where we must for more interests at home. And that means really difficult, horrendous compromises like you've just described.
Are you comfortable with it, though?
Well, no, of course not. I don't think anybody can, say that they're at peace with the idea of slave labour being built into, the future of green energy.
But I suppose, William, that the question then becomes, what should the government do? Because if we are a principled government, if we are a state that is standing against slave labour, do we trade those principles off for economic wins?
Well, it's another area where we have to be, a bit skeptical. I don't go all the way. I don't advocate ending all trade or investment with China. I've just said Trump is making a mistake on that. But, yeah, there have to be some real standards and some real caution. Now, we do have laws on modern slavery in the United Kingdom, and companies have to show that they comply with those laws in terms of their supply chains and so on. So I hope anybody operating in the United Kingdom is fully compliant with that law.
Yeah, and I think there are questions to answer about that. I mean, just the example of Shein, before Labour entered government, they were very clear that the questionable practices of that company would make it difficult for it to list on the stock market. And then once entering government, were very welcoming of the idea that Shein would list here. So I think there are some ethical questions potentially